Welcome to Racism is Real, where we tackle the urgent realities of racism in our society. In this series, we explore the systems of oppression that continue to harm marginalized communities and the movements working to create change. Through powerful conversations with activists, educators, and thought leaders, we aim to uncover the truth and take steps towards justice.
Hello, welcome to the Racism is Real series. Today we have Chantel and Deborah joining us today. Please introduce yourself and how you'd like to be addressed.
I'll let Debo go first. Debo, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. I'm Debo or Deborah. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a community organizer with BLMP, that stands for Black LGBTQ plus Migrant Project. And I'll pass it to you, Chantel.
Thank you, Debo. My name is Chantel. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm the founder of Blackbird Rising, which is a healing and wellness community in Philadelphia that centers the nourishment and the flourishing of Black, queer, and trans people and the community that loves them. I'm also a member of Roots of Justice, the collective of trainers who are doing anti-racism training. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, ladies. We are honored to have you two voices join us today for our discussion. I am your host, Sajina Carzo, a special education teacher's assistant and artist. And I am passionate about about conversations around justice, equity, and the lived experience of humanity. So let's dive in, shall we? Today's topic is about immigration, race, and xenophobia, unpacking how these themes intersect and how they show up in the real life of millions of people across this country. Our first question to our panelists is, how has the conversation around immigration evolved in relation to race and racism?
Well, I'll just start off by saying I think that the conversation around people's, whether they're immigrants, status, and whether they're here legally or illegally, is always been rooted in racism. There's the desirable immigrants, and there's people that we consider to be here that are not desirable. And that's always been centered around race and ethnicity of who those in power in our country believe is valuable to our society and desirable, and who they feel like is not who they want to have here. So I think that it's always been a part of it, but I think it's just gotten more hyper visible how racialized these immigration laws and practices are.
Yeah, and I would add that the evolution of immigration in this country has always been closely connected to the labor needs that this country has had. So, as labor needs increase and there needs to be looser borders to allow for those needs to be met, then you have policies that are a bit tamped down. And then as you need to do the opposite, you have heightened removal proceedings. So for example, in the 50s, you had something called Operation Wetback, which claimed to have deported 1 million Mexican migrant workers. And that was simultaneous to them having been incentivized to come here, not of their own volition, but incentivized, practically begged through the Bracero program. And so you've always had this connection between labor needs and migration patterns of different people from all across the world. You also saw in World War II, from 1942 to 1946, Roosevelt forcibly relocated and incarcerated over 120,000 Japanese people under something called Executive Order 9066. And so what I'm trying to kind of paint is that this narrative of that's happening right now around migrants and immigrants being a threat to our safety and or job security is totally only thrown around every single time it is inconvenient or America feels challenged by people living here of all sorts of backgrounds and statuses. And so, yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the contrasts in treatment, but just know that there is a connection. There's like this toxic relationship where when we need migrants, suddenly it's hush hush, come, work, live, play, school. And when there's a farce of we're feeling threatened, then suddenly we're going to have a massive removal program. So what we're seeing right now under what's deemed as mass deportations is really nothing new. It is the absolute reiteration, recycling of things that have been practiced many times before us in this country's history.
Yes, I would definitely agree with your point on this is nothing new. It has been done before. Looking at the alien enemies. Let me just give me 1 second. The Aliens Enemies Act of that is being used today in current times, 2025, by the Trump administration, targeting the Venezuelans, just as they did the Asian and Arab communities and groups, to justify sending them to those different prisons, the 130 men to those different prisons. And it's nothing new. This is a reoccurring thing we see in our history. And so my next question to you guys, to pivot a little, is how do you think social media portrays these stories and changes those narratives? How do you think they help shift and express the narratives of immigrants who are here in this country and are able to tell their story, except not only just from the government point of view?
It's coming. I have a very particular feed that is shaped by my community. So as a first generation, like child of immigrants, of Black immigrants, I think my news feed is like being very much funneled through my own community's lens. But one thing that's coming up for me is during the election, the statement about Haitian migrants and immigrants eating dogs. And that's a story I had not even heard. And growing up in Miami, Florida, around a large Haitian community, it was just something like, what are they even talking about? Like, what is the story, and why is it? Why can he say something so audacious and crazy, and people just believe it because maybe they don't have any relationship to Haitian Americans or Haitians, and like what is happening here? And so I do think that social media does tend to highlight and craft these stories of immigrant and migrant people that are sensationalized or oversharing these stories of kind of casting a bad light on Black and brown, especially migrants and immigrants. But like I said, my feed doesn't look like that because I listen to stories of resilience from my community, as well as stories of requests for support through my connection to BLMP and other immigrant and migrant networks. But I'll let Debo say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who like actively avoids social media, but also simultaneously when I am on there, I have a really crafted feed, similar to what Chantel was sharing. I think social media have y'all heard of the saying, things become the wolf that you feed? Like, it could be a force of good, it could be a force of evil. And I don't think that's the root of how we got to where we are today, where there's like a lot of vitriol, ignorance, and just like inaccuracies. Yeah, that is not what is getting us to like wrongful detention and deportation of legal permanent residents. That is not what is getting us to detaining people in Guantanamo or deporting them to a country that they're not from, and detaining them in the world's worst prison in El Salvador. Like, so I don't know. So my point is to say, social media is, you know, a tool. Whether it's good or evil, I'll leave that for others that use it more frequently to debate. But as far as like, I don't think that's how we got to where we are today. Yeah.
Agreed. That's an excellent point. I do think social media is a tool that allows first generation or just immigrants of any generation to tell their stories and tell their family histories and their lived experience in the US. Moving on to our next question, what are specific challenges that immigrants face compared to their white counterparts?
Immigrants of color. Well, I'll let Debo go answer this one first, and then because you be coming in with the good ones at the end. So let me let you go first.
Yeah, I mean, probably the best, a really good example to highlight is when the war between Ukraine and Russia began, the United States began implementing immigration policies that supported those Ukrainian migrants who were in crisis. So they, rallied resources to all the major international airports that were receiving Ukrainian migrants. They made sure that folks had, temporary housing, access to something called TPS, which is like a temporary form of legal status whenever a country is in crisis. And it allowed people who are already here from Ukraine on a visa to extend their visa without leaving the country. All sorts of like considerations were made to Ukrainian migrants, which was good. Now it's in stark contrast to the civil war that happened in Cameroon, for example, which started in September of 2017. And we didn't see TPS designation for Cameroonians until June of 2022. And that was a very limited form of TPS. So 5 years after the conflict began, whereas, it was with the Ukrainians, it was weeks after the conflict began in Ukraine that we saw this very rapid response to designating TPS for Ukrainians. So, I mean, there is probably 5 million examples that are similar to this. We see extremely disparate treatment of Haitian migrants and other Black migrants, whether it's the numbers of Haitian migrants that were detained during COVID, especially in family detention centers, meaning like the whole family unit was detained together. We also saw the literal whipping of Black migrants in the Rio Grande River between Texas and Mexico. And the Border Patrol had the audacity to like whip people in the river as they're crossing after they baited them into crossing for this big media ploy, as it turned out. So I'll pause there. I'll let you talk, Chantel. I have more examples though.
I think the examples speak for themselves. And I think just looking at how an immigrant like Elon Musk can find himself in a seat of authority and power in this country and be looked at as a valuable contribution to American society. And you don't see immigrants of Black and brown and BIPOC backgrounds being lifted to that same level of unfettered power and access. I mean, it does help that he's a bajillionaire. I know it's not a real number, but it helps that he is an incredibly wealthy person, I think. But even being able to access that level of wealth accumulation in this country is just not something really feasible for Black and brown immigrants and BIPOC immigrants of color, because of all the ways in which America works to keep resources out of the hands of the many so that the few can hoard it. Mainly white people. Yes. So.
Yes, very good point, ladies. And while I agree with that, how Nubian and Afro-Caribbean and just other immigrants of other communities have faced layered discrimination when coming to the U.S., you see some who are welcomed with open arms and others who are met with violence right at the border. I don't want to also take away from the resilience of those communities, the Nubian, Latinx, Asian, and other racially marginalized communities that have come here and have persevered and pursed through, leading in healthcare, music, entrepreneurship, even Latinx communities in the food system, cultivating that, and even Asian communities leading in tech, pioneering in tech, and reimagining different types of cuisine. And so, yes, while we acknowledge the disparities and the layered discrimination that these our groups face, I would also like to lift up and recognize that we persevered and was resilient and we move forward and do create a space here in America because we do form communities here. So thank you, ladies. Our last question for this discussion is, when it comes to allyship, how does that look like? And how does these allies and advocate work to protect the rights of immigrants in the communities that we do create and form once we get here?
One example that I really love is here in Philly, there's a Chinatown, and it's made up of people of various Asian descents who call that home. And it's a very established community, has been here for decades and decades. And the city decided that they wanted to build an arena, of sports arena in Chinatown. And it was met with a lot of resistance across the spectrum of people of identities in Philadelphia. There was actually a big surgence of African American and Black residents of Philadelphia standing up and saying, like, this is not going to happen. You're not going to displace a whole community that has been established here forever just to make a sports team have a new home, or to pander to companies like Comcast, which was the stadium that they were at previously, was owned by Comcast. And it went to the point that even our mayor, which is the first Black woman mayor of the city, was very much like saying, no, we're going to support, we want to have the stadium move here, even if it displace this whole community of Asian migrants and immigrants and first and second generation communities. And we fought and fought and fought. And some people fought and stood up and chanted and talked about protecting that community. And eventually the whole deal fell apart. And I believe that a lot of that happened because it was a cross section of people in the city from all different backgrounds saying, no, this community matters and we're going to protect it and keep it safe. And we value this community. And you're not allowed to just prioritize profits over people. And so it was a big win for Philly, actually, for Philly residents and everyday people here, but especially the immigrant and migrant community, to be able to keep a designated community space and neighborhood out of the clutches of developers. So that's something I feel like putting your feet there, putting your voice there, but being willing to stand up to big corporations who are predatory, communities that they feel are vulnerable, is a big part of protecting those who are here. But I know we're talking specifically about rights, so I'll switch to Debo if you want to talk about rights. And I feel a little sensitive about that word, but.
No, I mean, I think that's a good example of the one that you shared, because the reality is all of the different rights fights, whether it's for LGBTQ rights, racial justice rights, housing justice, healthcare justice, labor justice, there's all of those impact immigrants. And so plugging into any of these types of social justice fights that win back or take back power and rights for people is going to benefit immigrant communities. There are also tons of like rapid response or anti-deportation groups forming. Some have been around for decades. Some are from this year. People should look into those in their cities to understand what's happening locally. Because a lot of times, while immigration is technically a federal issue, it's also really varies city to city, and it's really important that we understand what our city and county officials and leaders are saying and doing for immigrants. So brushing up about what's going on in our own areas is a really big deal. A lot of us immigrant detention centers, maybe an hour or a couple hours away from the cities that we live in. And so some really horrific things happen in those detention centers that you wouldn't even think happen at all. I guess unless you're familiar with mass incarceration in the United States, but visitation is always helpful for folks who are detained, because a lot of times they're detained without community, without rights to legal representation, and honestly they're unlawfully detained.
Right.
So there's that. And then it's really important to know too that bonds and bail for Black migrants has averaged 54% higher than for other immigrants. We are in detention for longer periods of time. Our bail and bond is much higher than other immigrants. And also Black immigrants represent 24% of all solitary confinement lockups. So in addition to being detained, we're much more likely to be put into solitary confinement in these detention centers. So if there's a detention visitation program in your area, look into that. That's a good way to support, because it can mean writing letters, it can mean visitation, it can mean court accompaniment, because these court systems are they just operate in the black. People don't have eyes. Media doesn't have eyes on them. So having one or two neighbors, community members at your court accompaniment for your asylum hearing or something like that can often be a big deal in showing the community support for immigrants, but also for your own morale as you're going through these really scary hearings. Yeah. And then if you have Know Your Rights information, ILRC puts out those little red cards. Share those. If you have a small business, if you have one of those little libraries in front of your lawn or in your neighborhood, put those cards in your area. They come in over 25 different languages. And yeah, those are all useful.
And thank you, ladies. Our next question for you guys is, what does true allyship look like in these current times and in our communities, when you're talking about the centers where Brown and Nubian people are held at a longer and more disfavorable way than their white counterparts? What does community engagement look like?
So I'm just thinking about being in relationships of solidarity and reciprocity. So through an organization that I'm connected to here in Philadelphia, New Sanctuary Movement, where I was formerly on the board, and now I'm just a supporting member. We've had people who are seeking for asylum seekers who are in detention and needing somebody to host them come and be released to our community I used to live in previously and be hosted there. And I've had such a chance to be in relationship where they've helped me with things in my house and I've helped them with things in their home. And I've heard their story of truly harrowing stories of coming to this country and being in detention centers. I've done things like visit detention centers on tours, essentially to look more into what's happening around incarceration in our city, in our state. And I think just showing up and getting your eyes on what's happening and letting people know that like we see it and we care, and also being in these relationships of solidarity and reciprocity where we're not just looking to try to like give people, like act like people are only burdens, but that they actually are viable contributing members of our communities, and seeking to be in relationship with them, I think is a really beautiful start. I don't think you should do that out of a place of like, I want to help you. But like I said, relationships where you're sharing power and you're listening to stories and you're amplifying people's stories who are caught in these systems, I would say looks a lot more like active relationship building and allyship.
Thank you. We have a few comments from the chat. Michelle says, this is an eye-opening and thank you for providing ideas for ways to embody solidarity with immigrants. We have Dr. Peggy, welcome to our chat. And Jeffrey, we have the question. I think the Trump campaign uses the idea for looks or attention.
I don't think that's a question. I think it's like, yes, right. I mean,
that's
anybody, you're looking for scapegoats, and this is an easy scapegoat, right?
Yeah, looking for someone to blame and just cast as so-called evil.
Right. Vilify a community of people, whole communities of people. Yeah.
It's easy to build up hate when you're telling someone, yeah, you know, you have less rights than someone that just got here yesterday. How do you feel about that? Isn't that enraging? You're less likely to find a job. You're less likely to get benefits and all of these things. So it's really important that we're all participating in combating misinformation, because what is true is that immigrants pay billions of dollars collectively in taxes, and those who are undocumented don't receive any type of benefit back. So year after year of working, and you don't get Social Security as you become of retirement age if you aren't able to adjust your status. And there are folks who maybe for 20 years are undocumented and then 20 years documented, and they only get to benefit from the Social Security of the time that they were documented. And so there's just so much misinformation that we can all participate in combating.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about also talking about misinformation, like during the height of the pandemic, you know, like when we're talking about who's essential and non-essential workers, there were so many migrants and immigrants showing up to work because they were working in food service and they had to come into work, and they didn't have paid leave or PPE. They just had to keep showing up in order to feed and care for their families. And so there's no way that we would have made it through the pandemic the way that we did without literally on the backs of our immigrant and migrant communities who carried us and fed us and like kept showing up to work, so that our whole thing didn't collapse even more. And so I think to act like our community is not interwoven with, like, on the labor, like you said, the labor, completely dependent on the labor of immigrants and migrants communities, especially Black and brown ones and BIPOC ones, I think is really voluntary ignorance at this point, because how else do we even survive? Which is a tale as old as time in this country. You know, we love to use the labor of people for things that we don't want to do, or that we don't value.
Yes. And this is why podcasts and conversations like this is important, pointed out by Jeffrey. Obviously, the truth is in our face. So podcasts like this is essential for this age. And I want to thank you, ladies, for coming on today and sharing so generously with everyone. I'd like to, before we close, I would love to give you guys a chance to share with the audience what's coming up for you guys, whether that be personally or professionally, in ways that we as a community can support you.
Debo, you want to go first?
Folks can support BLMP by following us at blmp.org or on any of the social media accounts at official BLMP. And I also just encourage folks to look into groups like BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, also Haitian Bridge Alliance, HBA. Those are great organizations who are supporting Black immigrants every day.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that Clinton wrote a message about Black folks leaving the U.S. and I'm like, let's talk about that another conversation because I do have thoughts about that. But I'm not leaving anytime soon that I know of. But I will say that I feel that one thing that feels really clear to me about my role as somebody who, like, just a generation ago wouldn't have been a U.S. citizen is that there's a lot of power and privilege that comes with these papers, but that also could be taken away from me at any moment. And so how do I use those platforms of privilege to show up and those platforms of power to really speak out? And one of the things that I want to be involved in is making sure there's spaces and communities of care and support for people who are really living underneath the tyranny of this in ways that those with certain kinds of documentation are more protected from. So how do we show up and provide care? How do we provide spaces of healing? And that's something that I feel deeply committed to. And so people can get in touch with me, connect with me through Blackbird Rising on our website, our Instagram account, or through our email, and support our Black, Queer, and Trans Healing Fund if you're interested in figuring out how to get more healing resources to Black and Brown BIPOC immigrant community members.
Thank you, ladies, and thank you to our viewers for joining us on this installment of Racism is Real. Let's continue to have these conversations, not just here, but in our communities, our workplaces, and relationships. The real work begins where we carry these truths into action. So until next time, take care of yourself and others, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
That's all for today's conversation on Racism is Real. Thank you to our incredible guests for sharing their insights, and thank you for tuning in. Remember, awareness is the first step, but action is where the change happens. If you found today's discussion valuable, this series will return every second Tuesday evening. Also, be sure to check out our website and follow us for more information and topics like these. And consider making a donation to support our work. Together, we can challenge systems of oppression and work toward a more just future. See you next time.